So just a very simple, short task to welcome all of you here this evening for the annual Patrick Corish lecture. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Carlos Eire and his wife Jane, who are visiting with us to deliver the lecture this year. And Patrick Corish, Dr. Corish, needs no introduction to yourselves or recording to yourselves, who came here as a long association with this college, came here in 1939, ordained here in 1945, and 2 years later, at a very young age, was appointed Professor of Ecclesiastical History, President of this college for 1 year from 67 to 68, and then subsequently Professor of History at Maynooth University, or NUIM. And then more recently, I suppose, in retirement, contributed to the fabric of the college and by attending to the famous junior gardens. And during the year there, many of you will know that friends and colleagues of his erected a very lovely monument to him of the owl in the bush and a book outside, you see it. So it's a very lovely kind of record or memorial to his work in the junior gardens also. So we recall him tonight, who gave his life for this college as a priest of the Diocese of Ferns also. And so it's a lovely tribute to him that this annual lecture marks his memory and his legacy. So without further ado, pass you over to Professor Simon O'Ryan, who will introduce Professor Eire.
Well, Baloyer Galer agus Forgate Foilte Risht, Quig an Left Blaintul Sa in honor or Goglaki Osel and Monsignor Corish. You're all very welcome once again to this annual lecture in honor of our much beloved and much missed colleague, Monsignor Patrick Corish. And it's my great pleasure this evening to introduce this year's guest speaker, who is Professor Carlos Eire of Yale University. Professor Eire was born in Havana in Cuba, but in 1961, at the age of 11, he was airlifted to Miami along with over 14,000 other children in what became known as Operation Pedro Pan. And this was designed to protect Cuba's children from communist indoctrination, and was in fact the initiative of an Irish priest, Father Brian Oliver Walsh, a man who was originally from Portarlington, but who was at that time director of the Catholic Welfare Bureau, who were authorized by the US State Department to notify parents in Cuba that visa requirements were waived for the transportation of these children and that they could travel on commercial flights. At that point, it was the largest recorded exodus of unaccompanied minors in the Western Hemisphere. About half of the children who traveled were united with friends or relatives in the United States. Another 7,000 or so came into the care of the Catholic Welfare Bureau and a network of foster homes run by Catholic charities in about 100 cities and 35 states. Years later, Professor Eire would revisit this experience in his 2003 memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, which subsequently won the National Book Award and has been translated into more than a dozen languages, but is banned in Cuba. He would follow this story through with a second memoir in 2010, which he entitled Learning to Die in Miami. And he's remarked elsewhere that when this first came out, the American Association of Retired Persons, the AARP, got very excited about it, thinking that it was about older people moving to Florida to die. They'd obviously not read the subtitle, Confessions of a Refugee Boy. Professor Eire grew up in Chicago and completed his BA at Loyola University before going on to study for his MA and MPhil at Yale University, and remaining there to pursue doctoral studies under Stephen Osmond. And he was awarded his doctorate in 1979, which subsequently became his first book, War Against the Idols, The Reformation of Worship from Erasmus to Calvin, which was published by Cambridge University Press. Professor Eire has taught at a number of institutions, including St. John's University Collegeville and the University of Virginia, before being appointed a professor at the Department of History at Yale in 1996, essentially taking up the mantle from Professor Jaroslav Pelikan, who was made emeritus that year. Since the year 2000, Professor Eire has been the T. Lawrison Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale. In the intervening years, Professor Eire has published widely in monographs, edited works, scholarly articles and essays, including such titles as From Madrid to Purgatory, The Art and Craft of Dying in 16th Century Spain in 1995, Jews, Christians, Muslims, An Introduction to Monotheistic Religions, 1997, and A Very Brief History of Eternity, published by Princeton University Press in 2009. Now, he tells me that he had initially wanted to call the book A Very, Very Brief History of Eternity. But apparently, something I didn't know, some publishers are quite sticky on what constitutes very, very brief, and they calibrate this quite precisely. And unhappily for Professor Eire, the word count was just marginally too large. See, this is an occupational hazard that is not just for overzealous undergraduate students. Earlier this year, Professor Eire published with Yale University Press a monumental study of over 900 pages entitled Reformations, the Early Modern World, 1450 to 1650, of which Cambridge historian Eamon Duffy has recently remarked in a review, among the greatest merits of Eire's survey are its remarkable clarity in expounding difficult theological ideas and complex political changes, its calm comprehensiveness and its sober judgments, expressed with an unemphatic even-handedness. Eire's majestically comprehensive survey leaves no doubt about the enduring consequences for good and ill of the religious upheavals of the 16th and subsequent centuries. Professor Eire is currently working on a number of other projects, one of which is a study of attitudes towards miracles in the 16th and 17th centuries, and another project on the work of Teresa of Avila. And tonight's lecture draws on some of the work he has done in this latter project. This is Professor Eire's first visit to Ireland. So Carlos, it is a great pleasure to have you amongst us and to have your wife Jane here as well on your first visit to Ireland. Thank you so much for making the journey, and we very much look forward to hearing your lecture tonight entitled Ecstasy as Polemic, Mysticism and the Catholic Reformation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Salvador, and thank you for everyone else who has played some role in bringing me here. I'm delighted to be here. I consider this a great honor, and I've been wanting to get to Ireland my whole life, so I'm glad, extra glad. In addition to everything else, this is the frosting on the cake that I get to be here with you, and thank you all for being here. As Salvador explained to you, this is connected to other projects of mine. Right now I'm obsessed with the fact that in the 16th century, attitudes towards miracles and towards the supernatural changed dramatically in some parts of Europe. And we ended up having two very different kinds of Christianity. One very much grounded in the miraculous and in the interaction between the natural and supernatural, that being Catholic Christianity, and Protestant Christianity, which was in varying degrees somewhat uncomfortable with the mixing of natural and supernatural. And mysticism, mystical experience, mystical ecstasy is one of these areas that I think are among the many concerning the supernatural that mark a great difference between Catholic and Protestant in the early modern period. So I have a subtitle for my work on miracles. I don't have a title yet, but I have a subtitle, A History of the Impossible. Because in fact, this is what Protestants charged Catholics were trying to not only teach, but live out was the absolutely impossible admixing of natural and supernatural, as they saw it. So, without further ado, I begin with a quote. "I saw in his hand a long dart of gold, and at the iron's point there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also and to leave me all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness and excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it. The soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God. The pain is not bodily, but spiritual. Though the body has its share in it, it is a caressing of love so sweet, which now takes place between the soul and God, that I pray God of his goodness to make him experience it, who may think that I am lying." This is from Teresa's autobiography, chapter 29. Immortalized by Bernini at the Cornaro Chapel in Rome, an image with which I think almost everyone or everyone in this room is familiar. There's the text. It's not that long. But what are we to make of this strange mystical ecstasy reported by St. Teresa of Avila, or of the text in which she describes it, written in the 1560s? What are we to make in turn of Bernini's marble rendition of this event, so literal, so monumental, so utterly outrageous, sculpted nearly a century later? What is the historical significance of the experience claimed, the text that described it, and of the many images that seek to depict it? A mystical ecstasy such as this was considered extraordinary in its day, but nonetheless possible, at least in Catholic circles, both monastic and lay. Nowadays, any such experience could easily be dismissed in our secular Western culture as a psychotic delusion, or as in a 1982 article that appeared in the Catholic Historical Review, as temporal lobe epilepsy. How, when, and why did this change in perspective come about? To answer such questions, we must first come to terms with the historical context of the ecstasy itself, that is, with the religious crisis of the 16th century and the whole early modern age, otherwise known as the era of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. Texts and images such as these, and claims such as these, had a key role to play in the time period, not just as objects of devotion and expressions of religious fervor, but as flashpoints for disagreement and as markers of difference. For while Protestants renounced religious imagery as idolatrous, the medieval concept of sainthood as delusional, and all mystical ecstasies as blasphemous or demonically inspired, Catholics embraced all three of these with renewed fervor in the 16th century, largely in response to the Protestant challenge. In this lecture, I will analyze the role played by mystical ecstasies in the forging of Catholic identity in this early modern age, and more specifically of the ways in which ecstatic claims such as those of St. Teresa acquired a sharp adversarial edge in anti-Protestant polemics. Our central focus will be the ecstasies of St. Teresa, especially those described in her autobiography. which are among the most extreme, and one has to say, the most outrageous, described at that time. A few other illustrative examples of ecstatic claims will be examined too, as points of reference, but I will not dwell too much on anyone other than Teresa. This is the only known portrait painted while she was alive, and therefore most likely true representation of what Teresa of Avila looked like. Painted in Seville, at the Carmelite convent in Seville. She didn't like this portrait, by the way. She actually scolded the painter, who was also a Carmelite, and said, you made me look a little too haggard, too old. And this is another thing about Teresa, that she was always described as very beautiful, and despite all her fasting, was always described as sort of corpulent. But there you have her. She embodied so many Catholic traits so intensely that she could be called the perfect saint, the ultimate paradigm of the Catholic Reformation. She not only reformed her own Carmelite order, but actually reified Catholicism itself, especially those features of Catholicism that proved Protestantism wrong, and spent much of her time praying for those poor Lutherans elsewhere who, as she saw it, were all bound for hell simply because they had chosen to believe the wrong thing. But no proof was stronger or more dramatic of her Catholic identity than her ecstatic life of prayer. Mystical ecstasy was one of the most significant markers of difference between Catholics and Protestants. And while the Catholic world teemed with men and women who claimed union with God, conversed with Jesus Christ and his mother Mary, or flew or levitated or bilocated or read minds, or were stigmatized with the wounds of Christ, Protestants denied that any such phenomena were possible. Catholics could be skeptical too, though, and this is something I want to emphasize, because fraud was always possible, and so was heresy and demonic possession. And Teresa herself, like many other saints who would end up being canonized or declared doctors of the church, was examined by the Inquisition and was actually repeatedly denounced to the Inquisition even after she had died, as I will point out shortly. This scrutinizing, this vetting process sifted the wheat from the chaff constantly and yielded remarkable results, exposing feigned sanctity and lending extra weight to those mystics it judged to be genuinely holy. The Spanish Inquisition actually had an entire category of cases labeled Inventing the Sacred, which deals with monks and nuns mostly, who made extraordinary claims like those made by St. Teresa, a few of whom were cleared and declared genuine, like Teresa, but many of whom ended up being exposed as frauds. We historians need to deal with all these mystics, the frauds as well as the genuine article. And we need to deal especially with those who passed muster with the Inquisition, like Teresa. Their power over Spanish society and culture, and with Catholicism as a whole, was immense because they embodied the ultimate religious values. I'll give you but one example, an extreme example, perhaps the most extreme that I can think of. Sor Maria de Agreda. I don't know if you're familiar with Sor Maria, who lived between 1602 and 1665. In brief, she not only claimed to have bilocated to the New World, She actually never left the house that she was born in Agreda, which is in the middle of nowhere on the border between Aragon and Castile, because at the age of 15, her mother and father decided to both become monastics. Her father went off to a monastery in Burgos. Her mother remained at home with she and a sister and turned their house into a Franciscan convent. So from age 15, she never left their house, but reports surfaced of the lady in blue who was evangelizing the Humano people and the present-day border between Texas and New Mexico. But that's not all. She also claimed there have repeated visits from the Virgin Mary, who dictated to her her autobiography, 3,000 pages long, which contains many details not included in any of the Gospels or in any of the other apocryphal literature, with immense details. And as a matter of fact, when Mel Gibson filmed his Passion of Christ, he relied largely on Maria de Agreda's book. But that's not all. This is how important a person like this could be. An outrageous claim, somebody who can be in two places at once, somebody who takes dictation from the Virgin Mary, who not only takes dictation from the Virgin Mary, but in this autobiography of the Virgin Mary, depicts Mary as co-redemptrix of the human race, something not claimed very often in the 17th century. King Philip IV hears about this nun and goes out of his way to the front against the French and visits Agreda and establishes a relationship with Sor Maria, and they end up exchanging for the remainder of both their lives, because they both died about the same time, for the remainder of their life, over 300 letters, in which she acted as an unofficial, unsacramental confessor to King Philip IV. So we historians debate a lot about religion of the elite being different from religion of the common folk. Does religion percolate from above to below, or does it percolate from below to above? Here's a case of the most powerful man in Spain, and at that time, arguably the most powerful monarch and the richest monarch in the world, going out of his way to establish this relationship with a woman who claims to talk to the Virgin Mary and claims to be in more than one place at a time. I've looked at the Inquisition documents because she too was examined. And the Inquisition didn't pass any judgment on her bilocation, whether it actually happened or not. But it did clear her and said, she's perfectly okay. As to her autobiography of the Virgin Mary, the Sorbonne theological faculty condemned it. But what they condemned was the fact that it contained indecent passages relating to the sexual relations between Anne and Joachim, St. Anne and St. Joachim. Not because of the revelatory thing. But it was approved by several other theology faculties, including, of course, Salamanca and Louvain. The outrageous, what to us seems outrageous, and the impossible, was not only considered possible by common, simple people, but by educated people and the most powerful people of the day. And Sor Maria was not the only one to claim such experiences. I'll give you one more example before I delve into Teresa. Teresa's right-hand woman, Ana de San Bartolome, who was a simple peasant girl that Teresa taught to read and write, and then became one of the leaders of the Carmelite Reform and took the Carmelite Reform to the Low Countries and France. Here's a description of one of her mystical experiences. One day, as I was sitting near the spinning wheel doing some chores, for the sisters tried to distract me by keeping me busy with many jobs, my soul began to burn more than usual with the love of my spouse, Christ. And as this was happening, the Lord appeared to me, and he looked just as when he had been in this world. He approached me softly from behind, as would any other man in love who would want to surprise his wife. As he came near, he placed his hand over my heart, And it felt as if it were being ripped out. And I felt such pain at that moment that I unwittingly cried out. It was beautiful, this ravishing of my heart. And he left it in such a shape that it hurt a great deal, and it seemed as if it wanted to leave my body. This world of visions, apparitions, ecstasies, levitations was a resounding denial of Protestantism. And one of his most extreme exemplars was St. Teresa. St. Teresa was a somewhat lackadaisical nun until middle age. And it was not till the age of 40 that she began to dedicate herself to what was then called contemplation. It's a term that we now, scholars usually call mysticism. Contemplative experience gets called a mystical experience. But this is an old tradition, as old as Christianity itself, contemplation. As St. Augustine put it 11 centuries before Teresa's day, and I quote, "The contemplation of God is promised us as the goal of all our actions and the eternal perfection of happiness." Medieval theologians and mystics shared this belief and celebrated. The contemplation of divine truth is the goal of the whole human life, said St. Thomas Aquinas, because, as he also put it, contemplative life is according to that which is most proper to man, namely his intellect. St. Teresa pursued contemplation and eventually claimed to have reached the most exalted states. But she had some trouble with the details, as in this quote, "I would like, with the help of God, to be able to describe the difference between union and rapture, or elevation, or what they call flight of the spirit, or transport, which are all one. I mean, all these different names refer to the same thing, which is also called ecstasy." She had trouble with the terminology, but she didn't have any trouble describing the effects of these experiences on her. Teresa was struggling for precision, fully aware that inquisitors would be scrutinizing her every word to determine whether or not her extraordinary trances were of divine origin. Ordered by her superiors to write about her own life, and especially about her ecstasies and visions, Teresa had no choice but to put pen to paper and hope for the best. Given that her claims were so extreme, and that some in Avila and beyond its walls suspected her ecstasies might be feigned or demonic, Teresa was closely scrutinized. Her autobiography, then, was as much a test of her orthodoxy as a testimony of her holiness. And no other ecstatic rapture of hers attracted more artists, has ever attracted more artists, than the transverberation. And I'm going to show you just a few of the many different renditions of this experience that I began the lecture with. This is one of the earliest, which appeared in an illustrated, it's actually almost like what is now called a graphic novel. Let's call this a graphic hagiography, which was published in Low Countries in 1613. A series of plates, engravings, detailing Teresa's autobiography. But this is one of the earliest. But notice the size of the dart, because the Spanish word she uses is dardo, which means dart. It's a thin little weapon, not a gigantic spear. But I'm just going to flash these for you without any words so that you can see the many different ways in which this has been interpreted and how often it's been interpreted and reinterpreted. And I'm going to move through time from the 17th into the 18th century. There you have, that's one of my favorites by Bernardo Strozzi, also very early, 1614. This one by one of the few female painters to have taken on the subject. Josefa de Obidos, a Portuguese artist. In this one, you can see that the angel has turned into Cupid, and the dart or dardo has turned into Cupid's arrow. Here you have another long spear. This one looks a little more violent. And there is an expression of violence in her own description. Here in this one, Jesus is present, though he's nowhere in the vision as described by Teresa herself. This is from around 1700. Here, two more, and two more, three from the 18th century. More of the Cupid-like angel, although in this case, it's not an angel. In both of these, one from the 17th century and one from the 18th century, there is no angel. It's the boy Jesus, the infant Jesus, accompanied by Mary and Joseph, who is acting like Cupid and shooting an arrow into Teresa's heart. And these, of course, are painted to be hung in churches, convents, mostly in churches for public devotion. Three-dimensional. 18th century, 18th century, 18th century, and 18th century. Incredible. The one on your left kind of resembles the ecstatic look of Bernini. The one on the right, poor St. Teresa looks a little frightened, to put it mildly. Protestants, of course, by the time that she was describing this experience of hers in the 1560s, Protestants had for decades been denying that any such thing was possible. And here you have Martin Luther. And I'll summarize what is included here in these quotes from Luther. The quote is, "Christ is full of grace, life, and salvation. The soul is full of sins, death, and damnation. Here, this rich and divine bridegroom Christ marries the poor, wicked whore, redeems her from all her evil, and adorns her with all his goodness." This is from sort of his take, his interpretation of the Song of Songs. All this love between the soul and God, the usual exegesis of the Song of Songs in the Christian tradition. Luther sees this very uneven exchange. The soul, the human soul, is like a prostitute or harlot or whore, translated any way that you want. Christ just simply chooses to overlook her sinfulness. And in other exegesis that he has of the Song of Songs, Luther goes on to explain that this uneven exchange between Christ and the soul is so uneven that the soul is not just a prostitute, but the soul is a prostitute who stays in business and keeps practicing as a prostitute. And Christ chooses to overlook it. So it's a very uneven exchange. However numerous, sacred, and arduous they may be, these works of monks and nuns in God's sight are in no way whatever superior to the works of a farmer laboring in the field or a woman looking after her home. As clear an expression as you can have of Luther's rejection of the idea of sanctity or holiness being possible in this life. That in fact, there's only one level of being a Christian, and that is being a sinner, being simultaneously sinful and justified and having Christ accept you despite all your sins. But this idea of perfection, of rising in perfection, of rising in holiness, and of becoming ever more like God, or of experiencing the love of God, totally alien to Luther. His Reformed counterparts, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, explained it more in metaphysical terms. It wasn't this soteriological thing about justification by faith alone that they focused on. They actually had a metaphysical objection to the mixing of material and spiritual. Zwingli had actually a formula. Finitum non est capax infiniti. The finite cannot contain or convey the infinite. So this merging of divine and human in an ecstasy such as Teresa's is absolutely unthinkable in ontological and metaphysical terms. Calvin not only ascribed all such descriptions of mystical experience, like the one we find in Teresa, as demonic in origin, because, quote unquote, Satan has his miracles too. But Calvin also reaffirmed the finitum non est capax infiniti principle by saying that human flesh and the divine are as different from each other and as unmixable as fire and water. So all of this talk of divine ecstasies is either totally false, a lie, total lie, or perhaps the work of the devil. And I actually had a friend of mine, fellow graduate student, we both signed up for a course on medieval mysticism with Professor Stephen Osmond. But he came from an evangelical family. His father actually taught theology at Trinity Evangelical Seminary outside of Chicago. My poor friend Richard, he could only take 2 weeks of the class because after 2 weeks of reading mystical texts from the Middle Ages, he said he couldn't help but become physically ill every time he read one of these texts. It actually made him nauseous. So he dropped the class. He couldn't finish the course because this is how far the tradition has carried on. This idea of mixing divine and human, unthinkable. Teresa, on the other hand, is quite explicit in her autobiography because she's supposed to be explicit. Her superiors and confessors who order her to write about her experiences want her to be as detailed as possible. They not only want to examine the way in which she expresses it, but they're actually very interested in her descriptions. And she has some of the most graphic descriptions that we have in any mystical literature up to that time. She breaks several barriers in the graphic nature of her descriptions. And here we have one that I would like for us to contemplate, not to misuse the term contemplation, but to contemplate for contrast. This is one of her descriptions of the prayer of quiet, which can lead to the prayer of union. And again, as you saw before, she has trouble distinguishing between one kind of ecstasy and another. But let's dwell on this for a minute or two. With a very great and sweet delight, the soul feels that it's fainting away almost completely in a kind of swoon. Begins to lose breath and all bodily strength, cannot even wiggle the hands without great pain. The eyes close involuntarily, or they remain open. They can hardly see anything. And if it tries to read, it can hardly spell out a single letter or recognize it. It hears, but cannot understand what it hears, can apprehend nothing with the senses. Speaking is impossible, for it cannot bring itself to form a single word, and even if it could, it would not find sufficient strength to pronounce it. For all external strength vanishes, while the strength of the soul increases, so that it may better enjoy its bliss. What's happening here is, of course, not just spiritual as she's describing, but also physical. She would also, in other passages, complain about the pain that lasted for days after some of these ecstasies, especially the pain in her joints. She complains that it was even hard to pick up the pen to write with after these ecstasies. And this, again, is from that graphic hagiography published in 1613, which tries to depict some of her experiences. Here you have one where it's her spiritual espousal, where Christ becomes her bridegroom and actually says to her daughter, "You are totally mine, and I am totally yours." This tries to depict her vision of the Holy Trinity. And here let me pause for a second. Throughout her autobiography, Teresa is very careful, repeatedly, to point out that she does not have a theology degree from the University of Salamanca, that she's just a woman. And on top of it, I'm just a woman. I don't know how to speak about these things, but you guys, my confessors and my superiors, you're forcing me to write about these things, so I have to say something. But I'm just a simple woman, and I don't know how to describe these things. But, by the way, you know, yesterday I had a vision of the Trinity, and I understood it completely. And I can't explain it to you, but I understand it completely. And then here you have an artist trying to depict this outrageous claim. St. Peter and St. Paul in another vision show up and give her complete power over demons, because this is something else that happens to Teresa when she crosses over from the natural world to the other world. She not only sees angels and Jesus and Mary and Joseph and the Trinity itself, but she constantly encounters demons, and she knows how to handle them. Especially because Peter and Paul, two apostles, right, have given her special powers over the demonic. And she is the supreme demon slayer. Here's the extent to which Teresa goes into detail in her autobiography. If you have not read it, it contains some, depends on what kind of sense of humor you have. Okay. Let me dwell on this one for a minute or two. Her confessors are telling her, next time you see Jesus, you know, that's not really Jesus, that's the devil showing up to you. So, and they're trying to convince her. She goes to confession. She confesses, you know, Jesus came to see me yesterday and this and that. And the confessors are saying, no, that's not Jesus, that's not Christ, that's the devil. So, the next time you see Jesus, she's ordered by her confessor, the next time you see him, give him the fig, which was a 16th century version of giving the finger. It's, you know, putting your thumb between your two fingers. Next time that Jesus appears to you, give him. So, next time that Jesus appears, she gives him the fig. And Jesus basically says, thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad you're obeying your confessors. But go tell them I'm not the devil. I'm the real thing. And Teresa explains all this in her autobiography in great detail. She's walking a tightrope. She's walking a tightrope. She doesn't know. She's finally found a very young Jesuit confessor, because the Jesuits have just opened a school in Avila. A very young Jesuit confessor who is the first to say, no, your other confessors are wrong. This really is Jesus. But she's writing this to be examined. And she doesn't know how the men who are reading her autobiography are going to interpret her description of these experiences, all of which involve crossing over from the sensory world. Her death is interpreted by all her hagiographers as the ultimate ecstasy. Teresa died of a severe hemorrhage on October 4th, 1582. But the Gregorian calendar went into effect the next day. That's why her feast is celebrated on October 15th, because the calendar skipped 11 days. But all the hagiographies interpret her hemorrhage as a result of the ultimate ecstasy. And the theology is kind of strange, but very clear, that in fact, the ecstasy was so extreme. The soul left the body with such force that it caused a hemorrhage that made her die. So actually, in the lives of St. Teresa, not the one written by herself, but later, Her death is interpreted as the ultimate ecstasy. And it's not just spiritual experiences, it's bodily experiences. Teresa was not only seen to levitate by her fellow sisters and by other eyewitnesses, but is one of the very few mystics who has actually described what it is like to levitate. Her sort of theological / scientific explanation for levitation was that in ecstasy, the soul is drawn towards heaven so forcefully that the body is pulled up along with the soul. This is how she described it. In another passage, she also described these ecstasies as the soul goes out of the body as quickly, as rapidly, as violently as a bullet being shot from a gun. So up she goes. But here is one of her briefer descriptions. It seemed to me a tremendous force was lifting me up from beneath my feet, a force so powerful that I can't think of anything comparable. And as you see in her depiction, this depiction of one of her levitations, there are plenty of eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses who will swear and testify at her beatification and canonization process that yes, in fact, they did see her go off the ground. My favorite description, one time in the kitchen, this is described in the canonization inquest. She's in the kitchen cooking, and she goes into ecstasy and starts to levitate, but she has a pan of hot oil in her hand. But she's prioress, she's ordered the nuns to try to pull her down every time she goes up. So they try to pull her down with this pan of hot oil in her hand, and they're all worried it's going to spill on them. And this shows how perverse we scholars are. At some conference, I was talking to another person who works on Teresa of Avila, Jody Bilenkoff, and we actually laughed for about 3 minutes about this description in the canonization proceedings. Probably the only two people on earth who would laugh about such a thing, or actually know about such a passage even existing. But again, why am I doing this? Why am I telling you all these things? It's a point of contrast with Protestantism, where none of these things are possible. If you visit the convent of the Incarnation in Avila, you may see this portrait of Teresa and her young protege, John of the Cross, levitating together. And if you see the way that John is depicted, it's not only John who goes up, it's the chair that goes up with John of the Cross. And again, a little footnote. We love footnotes. Historians love footnotes, but this is a personal one. This is when I was clued in to this entire subject, was that I was visiting the convent of the Incarnation for the first time. And the tour guide is pointing out mundane physical details of the convent. Here's the staircase, here's this window, here's that. And then we get to this spot, and as if it was just a door or a window, she says, and here's the spot where St. Teresa and St. John of the Cross levitated together for the first time. That I thought, something is different here, something that has never been part of my education, even the 5 years that I attended Catholic school. St. Ignatius Loyola was also another levitator. There is no greater levitator. And here's another comparison. St. Joseph of Cupertino, patron saint of everyone who flies, pilots or passengers. And also patron saint of all exam takers. If you want in the question and answer period, and you're curious about this, I'll tell you why he's the patron saint of exam takers. But Joseph Cupertino flew more times, higher, more outrageously than any other saint in the history of the Catholic Church. So much so, you have to feel very sorry for Joseph. His Franciscan superiors kept sending him to ever more remote Franciscan houses because he was such a distraction. At first, he was attracting too many lay people, and they were distracting the Franciscans. But then he was distracting his Franciscan brethren so much, the poor man spent the last years of his life locked in his cell, allowed to come out only once a week, on Sunday for Mass. He had to eat all his meals alone because he was such a distraction to his brethren, because he could not help it. The slightest thing, is very Franciscan. Nature would sometimes send him into ecstasies. One time he was just, I forget exactly what he was doing, but somebody sliced open a pomegranate. And upon seeing the interior of a pomegranate, he went into ecstasy. Birds could send him into ecstasy. He was kind of a second Francis, but an extreme version of Francis. He is an exact contemporary of Sor Maria de Agreda. Their dates of birth and death are just within 2 years of each other. This is the very same time. Keep this in mind, okay? And this is very important. 17th century is the peak period for flying in Western history. But here's the strangeness of it all, okay? With Catholics, you have good people flying, saints, holy people. They fly. It's always involuntary. But there's the dark side too. Witches fly. So people who give their wills completely over to God can fly. Sometimes. People who give their will over to the devil can fly too. Cross the line to Protestants. It's very weird, very strange. Protestants do not believe that holy people can fly. They attribute all flying phenomena strictly to the devil. And they claim that witches do in fact fly. And they try them for witchcraft. My favorite court case in England from 1688, I think it was, or is it 1668? 1668. The very first judge in England to throw out a witchcraft case, because the evidence being presented was, I saw my neighbor's a witch, I saw her fly. And his decision was that there was no law against flying. And it set a precedent. So you have this other Protestant-Catholic divide, right? Very strange. More depictions of levitation. This painting is in the Louvre Museum. And it depicts an unknown Franciscan levitating who went into ecstasy much like Teresa while working in the kitchen. One of my favorite phrases of Teresa is, God walks among the pots and pans. Meaning, you can experience God in the kitchen while cooking. It's unpredictable, absolutely unpredictable. And this friar is working in the kitchen, angels take up his job. But of course, the Holy Spirit is inspiring Teresa. That's the Catholic interpretation. There's absolutely nothing demonic about this. On the contrary, it's all divine. And her writings are divinely inspired. Eventually, this is what happens. The Inquisition holds on to her manuscripts until her death. The Inquisition does not want the manuscript of her life or any of her other writings to be circulated. But as soon as she dies and the process of canonization is set in motion, then her works are released, and they're first printed in 1588, 6 years after her death. And even then, the accusations keep flowing in to the Inquisition. Everything's not clear yet, not quite. And here I'm starting to wrap up the lecture. Teresa is interpreted in her own age after her death as divinely inspired by many, including another mystic, Luis de Leon, who said, I did not doubt, but that the Holy Ghost was speaking through her in many places. It guided her pen and her hand. Luis de Leon was the editor of the first collection of St. Teresa's works to be published. And he wrote this in his preface to his collected works of St. Teresa. But in the hagiographies, the Lives of Teresa written, some published before she was canonized a saint, some after, you find these expressions. And here's but one of them. This is one of her hagiographers, Diego de Yepes, who was bishop, but wrote what was one of the more popular, by popular I mean best-selling, Lives of Teresa of Avila. Notice the polemical turn. And I'm only going to show you a few examples of many, many, many that can be found where Teresa is interpreted in this manner. And I quote, "God willed that at this time, when it seems that the devil is triumphant among the throng of infidels who follow him, and in the obstinacy to which so many, that's a typo, of so many heretical nations who take a side, to disgrace and ridicule him by putting before him not some valiant and learned man, but a lone poor woman, to sound the challenge and raise the battle flag, and to openly beget people who can trample, humble, and defeat him." Notice, Teresa is, in this passage, described as a warrior against the devil himself. But there are others who are more specific, including Diego de Yepes. This too was planned by God at almost the same time that the wicked Luther began to plot his lies and deceptions, to concoct the poison with which he would later kill so many. God should be forming the sainted woman so she could serve as an antidote to this poison, so that whatever was withdrawn from God on one side by Luther should be gathered and collected on another side by her. It's quite clear to Diego de Yepes. Teresa is God's answer to Luther, and nothing proves this, as far as Diego de Yepes is concerned, more clearly than her mystical ecstasies. Or more clearly, that her mystical ecstasies have affected her body. Her holiness has come to be embodied because her corpse refuses to decompose. That final mystical ecstasy that leads to her death, what is left behind is a corpse that will not decompose. And that too is interpreted by Diego de Yepes and others as not only proof that Protestants are wrong, but that the mystical ecstasies claimed by Teresa are genuine. That in fact there is this commingling of the divine and the human. That this commingling is not only possible, but that there is proof of it physically. That in fact, flesh and the divine are not like fire and water, but that they are in fact compatible, and that divinization is in fact possible to some extent in this life, in this world. Now, how can ecstasy be turned into some kind of argument? Well, of course, it can only be turned into some kind of argument under specific circumstances. And extreme times call for extreme measures. Here's what I want to argue. It's the fact that had Teresa appeared, let's say, 50 years earlier. She was born 2 years before Luther posted his 95 Theses. Had she been born 50 years earlier, had all her experiences before Luther came along, much of what she said, much of what she claimed, in fact, would have been very suspicious to inquisitors and to others. Many of those who denounced her as heretical and kept denouncing her even after she had died were Dominicans. And the Dominicans were sworn enemies in Spain at this time of anything that smacked to them of there was this heresy in Spain, alumbradismo. The alumbrados, or the illumined, were individuals who claimed that by this prayer of quiet, which Teresa practiced, in which at one point one stops praying and God prays in oneself. Alumbrados are accused of the Inquisition of claiming that this divinization is so extreme that one can achieve a sinless state. So this was what these Dominicans are afraid of when they're reading Teresa. And they blame Teresa, they accuse her of being an alumbrada. Let me read to you from one of these accusers, a Dominican named Alonso de la Fuente. And he's referring to her autobiography, and I quote, "This book has the venom of heresy within it, so secretly expressed, so well disguised, so smoothly varnished, that those who are ignorant, as well as those who are subtlest of theologians in the world, can use it as a sealed and closed manual, or as scripture read in the dark of night, unnoticed by Catholic ears." His denunciation also lashed out at the publisher who was promoting Teresa's work as inspired by the Holy Spirit. He was denouncing Luis de Leon, who was saying that Teresa was influenced by the Holy Spirit. The only inspiration Teresa could have received, charged Fray Alonso, was from, quote, "an evil angel, the same one who fooled Muhammad and Luther and all heresiarchs." And the most convincing proof of its demonic derivation, added Fray Alonso, was the fact that Teresa dealt with subjects that, quote, "exceeded the capacity of any woman." The fact that there were people, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in other parts of Europe denying that any of this was possible made Teresa's experiences not just acceptable, but exemplary, a polemical weapon that could be wielded as against Protestants as the truth of the Catholic teaching that in fact human nature and divine nature are not polar opposites, but can commingle. The Inquisition took these denunciations that came after her death and merely shelved them. They're such obsessive record keepers, they wouldn't throw them out. Of course, no, they archived them. And they're there. We can go and read these denunciations now. I just read to you this passage from one of the denunciations. But they did nothing. Had this happened 50 years earlier, there's a very good chance, I like to argue, very high probability, that Teresa's writings would have been kept under lock and key. And that she may have actually been not just accused of alumbradismo, as she was, but found guilty of alumbradismo and penanced. Very, very high likelihood that this would have happened. So extreme times call for extreme measures. Teresa affirmed that whatever she had accomplished could be aimed for and attained by anyone who set their mind and will to it, because humans had free will. And that will that we have actually determines our relationship with the divine. In sum, her mysticism bristled with everything loathed by Protestants and stridently denied by them. In an age when rival Christian churches define their identities as much by their differences negatively as by their beliefs, turning fine distinctions into weapons and constantly insisting that God was in the details of the differences, the mysticism of Teresa's autobiography was the equivalent of a thermonuclear bomb in the Catholic arsenal. In our own age, which is sorely lacking in mystics, or at least sorely lacking in people who want to speak publicly about their ecstasies, the Vita, the autobiography of Teresa, is no longer any kind of weapon, but is nonetheless a sharp-edged affront to doubters, and both a challenge and an inspiration for those who yearn for possibilities beyond our ken, especially that of eternal bliss and foretastes of it in the here and now, which require intensely high doses of self-denial. And that, my friends, is the very strange story, the very strange account of how it is that the experiences of one nun who lived between 1515 and 1582 became polemical. I've only read you a selection of passages from those who interpret her as God's answer to Luther. Fact is that when Teresa was, after her canonization, proclaimed co-patroness of Spain, there were many who were very eager to make her co-patroness along with St. James, Santiago, the traditional patron of Spain. Because the experiences that she describes in her autobiography and the experiences that hagiographers describe had made her an immensely, immensely popular figure. There were opponents, though, didn't like the fact that she was a woman, and didn't like the fact that no woman could match St. James as co-patron of Spain. I've given you my conclusion, but I'll end with this, which is a very strange twist to it all. The way in which sainthood, holiness, mystical experience can be turned into polemical weapons, not necessarily in the nicest or most correct way. Francisco Franco, the man who ruled Spain 40 years, made St. Teresa an honorary general in the fascist army, and actually pinned a medal on the relic of her hand and kept that hand with him wherever he went up until the moment he died, and continually promoted Teresa in almost exactly this parallels, almost exactly the same thing. As she was God's answer to Luther, Francisco Franco promoted Teresa as God's answer to godless materialism and Bolshevism. And you can find this literature easily enough. It's all in Spanish, but I'll end with this, which is somewhat funny. Again, it depends on your sense of humor. I was once explaining to my class one of my classes, this very strange turn, polemical turn, from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s and 70s. And that one time, Franco was traveling down a winding mountain road, and he always had the hand with him. So in this car, the door to the car opened at one sharp turn, and he almost fell out, but he didn't. And he credited the hand of Teresa with having saved his life. One of my smart aleck students raised his hand. He says, Professor Eire, maybe the hand opened the door. So there you have it, my final proof that these very sacred, very holy things can be turned into all sorts of polemics. I'll leave it at that. And then,
So thank you so much, Carlos, for a fascinating and very wide-ranging lecture. And I'm sure that you will have lots of questions and comments and points that you would like to discuss. I might take the privilege of chairing this to maybe ask the first question. One of the things that I was wondering about when you were speaking there is, in the whole area of polemics around, was Teresa of Avila genuine or not, either within or without Catholicism? Did many people appeal to earlier mystics of the High Middle Ages or the Late Middle Ages, women mystics, and their experiences, and say, well, here we have a figure like, Gertrude the Great, or Mechtel of Hockborn, or Julian of Norwich, or whatever, and they had similar experiences and would have been suspected at the time of being outside the pale by many figures. Was that argument made, or what was the relationship?
Oddly enough, I have not come across any such references. What I have run into is insisting that this is nothing new, and that this is a continuation, maybe that there are some details here that are new. This whole distinction between prayer quiet, prayer of union, and the difficulty she has with the terminology points to the fact that, yes, this is rooted in tradition, but now there's something else being explained here. And by the time you get to St. John of the Cross, of course, everything is very systematized. You can almost see the outline. But no, individual saints are not mentioned as examples that make this seem either more acceptable or, in any sense, normal.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Jeremy.
You were mentioning about St. Joseph Cupertino as being the patron saint first taking exams, and then you were going to give the reason.
Yeah, I said, well, now that you're asking the question, I can tell you. This is the traditional hagiography. Joseph of Cupertino was, for all practical purposes, the village idiot. All the hagiographers say he was not very smart. As a matter of fact, he worked as a lay brother at cleaning out the stalls. But Franciscan Superior came to the house where he was mucking out the stalls, and as an act of, to force the superior of the house to an act of humility, he ordered him to train Joseph for the priesthood. And Joseph studied and studied, but he could only memorize one passage out of the entire Bible. Comes exam time for ordination. And the bishop is running out of time. There are too many young men to be ordained. About 3 or 4 men before he gets to Joseph, he's down to asking only one question. And when he gets to Joseph, the one question Joseph gets asked is about the one passage in the entire Bible that he knows anything about. So he passes, and he's ordained. So the prayer to St. Joseph of Cupertino goes something like this: "O Joseph, please, I ask that I am only examined on those things that I know." So he's the F student who aces the exam. This is the American grade system. He's the failing student who passes the exam because he's specially graced. And actually, in American newspapers, under personals, the personals columns, you often see testimonials. "Thank you, St. Joseph, for helping me pass my exam."
You have a question? Yes.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture and welcome to Ireland. My question is in regard to Protestants, Calvin and other Protestants mention how Satan has his miracles. Are they implying that Satan has more power than God?
Well, that's a good question. No, they don't. They never go that far. They know enough to say Satan is a creature. Satan is not divine. Satan is a fallen creature. He's a fallen angel. But for some unknown reason, some mystery, God still allows the devil to trick people. And once while reading through Luther's table talk, actually Luther talked a lot at the dinner table and students took notes. And I think with every beer that he had, he became ever more outrageous. So one of these passages, somebody asked him more or less this question: why does God allow the devil to do all these terrible things? And what he came up with was, I think, an image that points to, for him, the mystery. He said, God allows the devil to do all these things. Sometimes he actually orders the devil to do these things, and he looks at him through his fingers. Almost like in a horror film when we don't want to see a scene and we kind of peek at it. Now, they never explain why that's so, but no. The devil is a creature, and whatever he does is something that God allows. And that is also the medieval Catholic theology, the medieval Catholic demonology, is that whatever the devil does because God allows him to do that. But the Protestant demonology is very, very close to medieval Catholic demonology. They don't reject that. They reject part of the Catholic theology, but they don't reject the demonology.
So why do they have such a dislike for the ecstasies of the saints?
Well, they have a dislike for it because their theology of salvation and also their understanding of human nature and of divine nature is such that any kind of close relationship of the sort between the soul and the divine, as described by Teresa and other mystics, even those came before her, is considered impossible. And that if it does happen, this is why Calvin says Satan has his miracles. If anyone has these experiences, they must be demonic. But keep in mind that some of Teresa's confessors were telling her the very same thing, that her experiences were not divine, but rather demonic. So there's that kind of continuum, but the difference is Teresa finally finds a confessor who says, no, these are not demonic. These are real divine experiences.
Questions? Yes, Andrew.
Can you maybe expand a little bit more on why it is that the Protestants were skeptical of this close relationship? Because I'm just thinking of Luther. There's a story of his profound religious experiences, whether it's in the thunderstorm or whether it's in the Augustinian priory, and he's reading Romans, and he comes to this profound realization of grace. And most would say that's at the very least a religious experience. So what is the word? From whence comes the skepticism of these, say, ecstatic experiences, if you want to call it that? Is it the physical nature of it, or what makes one say something demonic, and what makes his own religious experiences valid.
Yeah. Well, to say that they're uncomfortable with these mystical experiences and ecstatic experiences is not to say that they're uncomfortable with religious experiences. No, you still, within Protestantism, have profound religious experiences. But in their theological framework, religious experiences are bound by this dramatic, drastic, metaphysical, and ontological difference between the human and the divine. And the human incapacity to merge or become one, to have union, or any kind of ecstatic love experience with the divine. This is not to say, however, I'm glad you asked the question, this is not to say that this doesn't re-enter Protestantism later. In Methodism, it comes back to some extent. And then you read some passages from the late American Puritan Jonathan Edwards that kind of verge almost on admitting that one can feel this bond of love between oneself and Christ, right? It comes back, but in the 16th and 17th century, it's not till the late 18th century that it kind of re-enters. And with pietism among Lutherans, you have that to some extent. But it's the reformers, the major reformers, the one who start the process. Their anthropology, their understanding of human nature was such, and their soteriology, their theology of salvation was such, that this, any talk of union, or even of ecstasy, of this great feeling of love and so on, it's just unacceptable. To them, it had to be wrong.
Yes.
Late Andrew really gave a difference between Protestantism and Catholicism as follows. He said the Protestant imagination, the transcendence of God, and the freedom of the individual. The Catholic imagination, the presence of God, and the sense of community.
Could you say that last part again, because I couldn't hear?
Presence of God, Catholic imagination, the presence of God, and the sense of community.
And that's true, but that's more modern than early modern. Right? That's more modern than early modern. What's striking about Teresa and other mystics from her period is the individuality rather than the communality. These are considered special human beings who reach this level, and that the admission is made, yes, they have an effect on the community as a whole, but there are always very few of these people. Now, they're few in number. Yeah.
Okay, any last burning questions before we wrap up and move on to the next stage? Oh yes, Daniel.
It's maybe a bit crazy, but I'll give it a try anyhow. I'll leave it up to you if you want to make anything of it or not. As you're describing the polemic in the 17th century, it was hard for me not to think of earlier polemics. So you can very broad brush strokes here. Please forgive me, those in the philosophy department, by Eire. But say the tension between the nominalists and the idealists in the 12th century, between, that is to say, those who believe that created things participate in the very ideas in the divine mind, versus those who would say that things are just
That's
things. Right. And then later, you have the reaction of Duns Scotus and Occam to the scholastic contention that you can come to know things about God through the contemplation of the sensible. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about how this polemic relates to these earlier polemics that both seem to be characterizable as a position which is perhaps optimistic about what we can know about God or participate in God through the sensible, and another that seems more skeptical.
Yeah. Well, Luther had read some nominalists. He had read Gabriel Biel. And Luther had also read some mystics. And actually, one of the very first things that he publishes during his break with Rome is a mystical treatise from the Rhineland tradition, the Theologia Germanica. But he breaks with that mystical tradition. What he does pick up from nominalism that I think affects his attitude towards the way in which the divine relates to the material, or the creator to creation, is this whole idea that God is so transcendent and his very omnipotence is so beyond our comprehension that there's no way that one can ever know with any certainty how exactly God is present in the world, except through his word in Scripture. This is the biblical turn in Luther, right? He rejects the idea that theology has to make rational sense all the time. So for instance, and I hope this helps to clarify it, he continues to believe in the real presence, which makes him different from the Reform. To that extent, he says yes. But he's very nominalist about it. In his argument with Zwingli in 1529, Zwingli's argument is very rational, very logical. He says, well, Jesus had a human body, and he ascended to heaven, and a human body can't be in two places at once. So therefore, Christ can't be present in the Eucharist. And Luther's response is, you're being too mathematical. God doesn't work like that. God said, take this and eat. This is my body. And he said, if Jesus had said, and if God had ordered me to eat manure, I would. In other words, kind of the old troublesome question. Could God have saved the human race by becoming incarnate in a donkey? Luther's answer would have been yes. It doesn't have to make sense. It's purely God's will that makes this happen. So I believe he's present because he says he's present. Otherwise, his presence makes no sense. He's actually saying his presence makes no sense whatsoever. You just have to accept it. Does that help to? Okay.
So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So, Carlos, thank you once again, and I think you'll feel the appreciation here this evening.
Thank you.